My name is Joe Ross and welcome to my channel. So, I want to discuss more this one topic that science really has made no progress on and is completely ignorant to the workings of, and that is human consciousness. Now, to be clear, science has made a lot of progress on, neuroscience, studying neurons and parts of the brain, and they can even tell where consciousness probably stems from, as opposed to other parts of the brain that seem to think and process without us being aware of it. And then there's the parts of the brain that we are conscious of what is going on there. So there is a lot of progress made in that area, but we still have no idea how consciousness actually comes to be in our universe with the laws of physics that we know. So there is something else going on that we are just completely unaware of. When I say we, I'm saying mankind. We just don't know what it is that leads to the consciousness. And to emphasize this, and also this is just an interesting thing to think about, science has no clue how they would ever program in consciousness to, like, AI, for example. Let's say you made an AI that acted exactly like a person. We have no idea what steps we would need to take to program in consciousness. We don't know if there's any limitations to the media that the system is in. For example, we are made of organic matter, and we have consciousness. An AI or a robot would be made of metals and silicon and plastics and other things. But we still both operate on electricity. We have electricity going through our neurons, and a robot would have electricity, going through its whole system. We don't know if there's some limitation to, like, an electronic system that maybe it could never be conscious. You have to have an organic system. But again, this just emphasizes our cluelessness on the topic. There's a couple interesting things to think about in regards to consciousness. The first is that consciousness only seems to occur or stem in part of the brain and only seems to encompass certain thoughts. So there are just a set of brain operations that we are conscious of. There's a whole other set of brain operations that we are not conscious of. Obviously, we call it the subconscious brain. But think about that for a minute. Your operations in your brain that you know of are going on, and there's a whole set, probably a much larger set of operations going on that you just have no clue. And it's not just, breathing and heartbeat and stuff like that. There's thinking going on. And this subconscious thinking often leads to, intuitive things like emotional feels about circumstances that you walk into, vibes you get from people, things like that. All this processing is going on in the subconscious mind, and we can't use consciousness to really modify it, other than we can train our subconscious mind by feeding it factual information that we kind of get through conscious thought. The other thing to think about that's interesting is conscious thought seems to have a strength and a quality. It's not just a matter of are you conscious or not conscious. To emphasize this concept, think about dreaming, for example. Not daydreaming, actual dreaming at night. You are conscious. You can think about what you're doing in the dream. You feel that you're experiencing something. You can hold memories that you then have permanently. But this isn't the same consciousness that you have while you're awake. So these are two different qualities of consciousness. Another one would be, like, if you take a mind-altering substance, you're going to have a different type of conscious experience. The quality can be completely different. With certain mind-altering substances, you don't see anything that's in front of you, all the activities going on in your imagination, in your mind, but you are still conscious. You don't have to be seeing what's here in front of you or hearing what's out there or even feeling anything to be conscious. You can be conscious and only be thinking about things in your brain. And consciousness can have a strength. So, for example, you get a concussion. The moments after you get hit, you're less conscious. You're not unconscious all the time, but you're struggling to keep consciousness. So you're not fully conscious either. You're somewhere in the middle. And this can also happen when you're waking and falling asleep. Also, medications can do things like this. There's also evidence that seems to point to the fact that throughout the day, you're not actually conscious continuously. Like if you daydream or you're doing an activity, a lot of that time you're not fully conscious. You're operating on like an autopilot mode. And then as soon as something changes, your consciousness kicks back in and you tell yourself the story that you've been conscious the whole time. So, I mean, these details are hard to study scientifically, but there's some evidence that that may be true, that you're not always conscious, but you just notice your consciousness throughout the day and you tell yourself the story that you've been conscious the entire time. But clearly, you can't look back and remember every second of your day. There were a lot of seconds that, are lost now. You can't remember them at all. So there are 3 theories of consciousness that I'm interested in that I'm going to share with you. Spoiler alert, I don't think any of them actually really substantially give us any answers, but they're interesting to think about, and maybe one day we'll get some more info on these. The first one is Panpsychism. Not to be confused with pantheism, which is that God is the universe. But Panpsychism is that there is a consciousness attribute to everything in the universe. But the smaller and simpler the thing, the less it shows this consciousness characteristic. So even an atom or potentially a subatomic particle has like a tiny, minute aspect of consciousness. And when, the system gets more complex, you have more atoms and electrical signals going back and forth and things are moving together, that consciousness gets emphasized, and then you can eventually have a system like a human being or an animal that experiences consciousness. It's hard to say whether something like this is true, we just can't study it, but I think there are some issues with the theory, which is consciousness doesn't just arise from a complex, system. It arises from a specific complex system. I mean, just look at your brain. The whole thing is a complex system, but the conscious part of it is only in one part of it. The universe itself is a complex system, and maybe the entire universe is conscious, but I don't think there's any evidence to believe that. So it's not just a matter of getting atoms together and eventually when there's enough of them they become conscious. There's more to it than that. Which leads me to the next theory of consciousness, which is the emergent theory. So that is to say that it's not an attribute. Consciousness is not an attribute that you can even apply to like a single molecule, for example. Just like density or temperature, we're talking about physics here. Density or temperature is not an attribute you can apply to one molecule. But once you have a few in an area, then you can start talking about attributes that apply to the whole set. So the emergent theory is that consciousness emerges from a system. So once you get enough molecules and electrons and things going on, that results in consciousness, but this theory still doesn't explain how that results in consciousness. And the final theory I'm interested in, but I think is dead wrong, is that consciousness is only an illusion of our own minds. Some highly respected philosophers believe this, and I just don't see how. I mean, maybe I'm missing something, but if we have the experience of doing anything, that can't be an illusion, because even if our mind was telling us that we were conscious throughout the day and we weren't, in that moment we are, because our mind's giving us the experience of telling us that we were conscious. So this confuses me, and maybe, maybe there's more to it that I'm missing. And if somebody out there can explain to me how this could possibly be true, I would love to hear it. The most important thing to me here, and this is sort of gets into the spiritual thinking or the merging of the scientific and the spiritual, is that when science figures out what consciousness is, it's not going to reduce our conscious experience. It's not going to downgrade anything. We're still going to be living life just as fully as we are not knowing what consciousness is. So it doesn't actually matter if science figures out what consciousness is. I mean, they've figured out a lot of things so far, and we may have to change our belief systems, which, and this is the issue, certain religions don't like to do that, but we can still live a full spiritual experience, even knowing exactly what consciousness is. But I think if that happens, it'll be a long, long time from now. So, thanks for watching, and please like and subscribe and comment. I definitely want to hear what you guys are thinking about all this stuff.